YOLO composing gloves here, and today we're going to be doing some stuff with sub bass. So this is a project file that will be included, and what it is it's two loops here. We've got this sort of short, slower loop, and we're going to add a sub bass and look at various things to do with bass that go on here. And so it's a really chill loop. It's missing a lot of elements. It has room for improvement, which is the point. You're supposed to work on it, and it will hopefully give you a grounding if you're not used to writing tracks as, places to start, general points you should be at in production where you could add a sub bass or start considering it. So here is this one we're going to add a bass to. And so if we just give it a quick listen. So, I mean, that is a pretty solid just set of things. We could really expound on it, probably pick different sounds. I mean, we've got something to work with here. So that was my goal here. I wasn't going to sit here and write like an amazing beat, because that would then what would be left for you to do. So that is what's going on here. And I use all stock stuff, so you shouldn't have a problem opening up these project files. I'm using like FL keys, really standard. Actually, it sounds pretty dang freaking amazing for apparently 3 megabytes. That is astounding to me. And so if we come over here, we have a second loop. Now this is sort of like a down tempo synth loop. All these sounds, besides like the keys, are Synth1, including that little ARP thing you heard. And so on this one, we're a little more concerned with mixing and ways we can augment the sub bass. Perhaps make it cleaner so that the drums and other things come through a little more clearly, or maybe ways we could augment the sound of these bass notes. So a lot of times you might, like, this could be totally applicable, even though I'm not going to explain all that's going on with this sound, and that you might be working with a preset, and knowing how to just augment some basic things without knowing how the preset is actually doing how it sounds is really useful. Now you can go through presets and have a little bit more knowledge on your hands. So this loop sounds like this. So that's sort of your assignment. So see what you can do with this, see what you can do with that. And we've already talked a great deal and had tons of videos on these subjects. So this would be something that you at least have a little bit of idea of what you could do. When I do this section, I am going to be talking about some chords, and I am working with sort of more advanced chords, but don't get overwhelmed by it. You'll see I'll make it very straightforward and largely blow over any of the overly like, we won't get into music theory. Don't worry about it. So you'll see how you could use this in your own tracks too. Also, I have a notebook here, which actually should boot up and be at the top thing when you open the project file anyways. And I'll even put it in fact, let's do that right now. We could come in here to the project and put that in the comments. And now it'll pop up for sure when you open it. So anyways, I have a similar, this is just an explanation, things I want you to consider as well as what I want you to do. So if you haven't tried this yet, please pause this video, come back to this video, pause it right now, because I'm about to do a lot of this stuff. And read through this, go through it on your own, slug it out, and then come back after you've given it a solid go and see some additional routes you might have taken. You'll remember a lot more and learn a lot more if you do that. So, okay, so assuming that you've given it a go, or maybe you just want to see what I'm going to do first because you got stuck or something, or you're just lazy, let's go ahead and see, let's go ahead and do this. So, first let's talk about the general sounds. So over here, these bass sounds are coming largely from distortion effects. So there's an internal distortion effect that's going on, and I'm augmenting the spectrum by the use of a filter. Now, I like to use equalizers as sort of custom filters. It's something that the more you do, the more you get into sound design, the more EQs like this are just handy. So I'm like, the sound here is created by an EQ. If we look at this. Really, really handy handy ways for creating extremely specific flux, which is something from our first lesson, right? Flux. So there's something to consider. Let's go ahead and come over here and let's look at adding a sub bass. So here we want to add a sub bass. It's a pretty empty sounding track. And you know, right now we're working with a small loop. If we were making a real track, we'd have an intro and we'd have to consider how we want to bring elements in. Usually you don't want your bass right there at the beginning. It's usually a supporting element at a moment of impact or a moment where you're just jamming. And this is a pretty chill vibed sound that I'm picking up anyways. This is the way I feel about it. So I want to add a sub bass, and let's just pretend that here is where things get rolling. So I want to add a sub bass to this spot right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new Synth1. And just because now we've already talked so much about sub bass, how to make a sub bass, what a sub bass is. It should honestly be really easy to make a sub bass. What the hard part is now is the songwriting that's attached to it, as well as the mixing. A lot of times these are just sort of overlooked. Like I overlooked them a lot in my earlier lessons, assuming that people would just sort of figure it out. So let's go ahead and take a look. So to build, let's just make a new one real quick. So I'm going to replace it with a new Synth1. And I always hit shift click, and then I'm just going to name it our sub. And I usually make my subs or any bass related things some shade of green. That's just a color code I have. So it's green. I also use green for sends a lot of the time too. Usually it's like a lighter shade of green. So, okay, we have it open. And the first thing I do is if I play a note, I'm playing pretty low already, and I'm just going to use a sine wave. I'm not going to use my sub because it's pretty much linked. I'm going to have to use the output of my first oscillator. So I'm just going to use the first oscillator and use a sine wave. And so we've already got that. And I'm going to go ahead and bring my attack actually right about there, 34. That's how fast my volume turns on. So that sounds about fine. I'm pretty cool with the envelope. We'll talk about envelopes in later lessons. So we're already done. We already have made our sub bass. So now we want to come in here and add it. So I'm going to come over here to this pattern, and I'm just going to let it sort of loop. And what I want to do is add some notes. And so now, without like getting crazy, these are the chords I'm using. And I sort of added in all the little bells and whistles here, but you could sort of look at it just as a modal chord progression. And that's as much as I'm going to say about the theory side of it, because I said I wasn't going to go crazy theory. Basically, what we want to do is we want to listen for a natural progression. Usually, if you use the roots of the chords, so if I'm playing C major, I'd have a C in the bass. If I'm playing D major, I'd have a D in the bass. Usually, that's a pretty good idea, just as a rough starting point, but not always. So I think here, though, it'll work out pretty nicely, because we go from C to D to G to D to C. So it has this up-down symmetry. So if we just come down here, I'm probably going to be putting in C3s. So let's just go ahead and play our first measure. And we say, okay, let's try putting a C down, because that's in our chord. And you could try other chord members. However, if it's the first chord, you almost always want to stick to the root. If you pick something else, you generally want to have a reason. And so we could just put a whole note, but that's kind of boring. But we could totally do that if we wanted to. I don't want to. It could totally vibe for some things, but for this one, I feel like we could have like a do, and we could maybe even crescendo a little bit. So that's kind of cool to me. And then the next, I hear like a do, like we've gone up, do, re, something like that. So put a note up here, the D, and that is also the chord. So you were playing a D7 chord, and a D makes sense. Whoops, didn't want to do that. So I'll drag the D over here. And to me, that sounds pretty cool. And maybe these, instead of getting louder, we maybe get a little bit softer here. And this is something, if you play piano, like especially if you play like Chopin or some other classical pianist, romanticist, you like when you play it, these small phrasings make like a huge difference in how it sounds musical. I was teaching this to a student the other day. I teach piano, and it was like, to me, I've been doing this for so long, it was just a natural thing. Like I naturally add crescendos, decrescendos. Not all staccatos are made equal. Anyone who's like played for long enough knows like you can hit the keys a whole number of different ways, and how you enter the keys and your wrist movement, all these things come into play. And so I was explaining this to him. Oh man, he improved like 1 billion times. And as far as musicality goes, just by doing these small little changes, suddenly took like I gave him a pretty easy revision of Beethoven's Seventh, just the main theme from I think it was the second movement, like do 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 do, that one. And if you haven't heard it, go check it out. It's an awesome piece. And oh man, he just proved so much. So things like this, all I'm trying to say is things like this matter. They can really add a new dimension of life and nuance to your songs. And over here, maybe we'll do a slight pitch bend down. So to do this, since Synth1, and I feel like this should come back down a little bit instead of going up. So to add a slight pitch bend inside of FL, what you do is you come in here and we have our pitch bend set range. So if I play a note, that's how I'm going to control it, right? So I'm going to right click and I'm going to edit events in piano roll. You could automate it. Some people are fans of automating. I personally am a fan of editing things directly in the piano roll. We want our note to start in tune, which is going to be this little middle spot. You sort of just have to eyeball it. It's not a huge deal that it's right on the money, but you want it pretty close. And then we want a pitch bend. Let's listen to where we want it. I'm thinking like right here. Something like that. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So I'm thinking of something like that. And we want to go back to being in tune. We don't want to be down there forever, you know? To me, I heard that. That's the way you would go about doing something like that. I prefer to do it in this because then it attaches the data to the piano roll. I'm hoping one day we get graphic things here that allow us to not have to do this eyeballing thing. But, you know, it's not that bad. So, okay, now we'll go up to the G. I mean, like, holy crap, I've been on this measure forever, I know. But, you know, I thought these things were worth mentioning. So, let's give it a listen. Oh, and our pitch has been offset down there, so we also have to set a value at the beginning. This is one of those things, but other DAWs have this issue too, so it's not just FL, but some of them have line editors that are just nicer to work with. Maybe we'll go down to a G. And then here I'm thinking of 2 half notes. Maybe like an A to a, we're working with a D add 2. Let's see here. Was it an add 2? I thought it was an add. It is an add 2. An E. We could go from the A. We could pull, well, we could try going down like that. And then it could resolve down. That's pretty cool. So let's try that. And then here, now our pitch bend is by an offset of 2, right? So the furthest our pitch bend can go right now is 2. If we increase this to like 12, we'd be able to pitch bend a whole octave. Using 2, we could go to the nearest note. So right here, I'm thinking at the end, we could have this sort of run down to C. And that could be a pretty cool thing to do. Something like that. Oh, and you right click to get these smoother lines. Now, something else we could try doing is on these, maybe instead of just going down there, we could have them overlapping a little bit, and we could turn on mono. So the difference in mono, check it out. There's this sort of bleeding. We want legato now that I think about it. So you see it's not as plucky as. that this re-triggers our envelope. This one doesn't. It just sort of glides to the next note. So we'll talk about these modes later, but they're very commonly applied on sub bass. So we want it in legato so that if our notes overlap, it'll just slide to that next note as opposed to going bing again. Now, in this case, I think we do want the redone articulation. Anyways, there you go. So you can consider adding things like that. There's like a whole bunch of things to consider. Now we might say, okay, we've got our sub bass, and you would obviously put it in maybe a bit faster than that. Take your time, consider things. And we could even maybe add, instead of having it be a sine wave, we could have it be a saw wave and use a filter. So if we put this using Control L, put it in a mixer track, we could add an EQ to this. Parametric EQ 2. I need another order 8. So like you can only get so much reduction out of one. And so I don't want this to be a shelf. I want this to be a low pass. So as a filter mode, you get a lot more. So you can do some automation like that if you want to get fancy. It sounds kind of dopey though, so we're not going to do that. But just showing you an option. So now let's go ahead and take a look at where our kick's at. So looking here, we see our kick has this. I dipped a little bit here because I thought this has sort of defined the kick. And we could also dip some here as well. Bring some of that down. And our sub is very loud right now. So what we could do is just take that and just bring the volume down a bit. So I know this isn't like the most exciting thing to add, but honestly, adding one skillfully really adds a new feeling to a track. And when you want to add a lead or do more interesting things on top of this, all these things sort of go on in the back of my mind at least. Maybe they don't go on in the back of yours. Honestly, from here, it's probably just volume automation. You don't really need a compressor because it's just a sine wave. So just control it with your fader. And with our kick drum, we just want to make sure we have a complementary kick cut or boost wherever we have our sine wave hanging out. Now our sine wave our sub bass is going to be moving around in a spectrum. And so we sort of have to ask the question, how are we going to make our kick get through? And there's a couple ways. One of them is to just boost it or have it just be generally louder than the sub. The other way is to cut the low end of the kick and have the sub fill the low end and have the kick be defined by the high end. And then I usually settle on a mix. So I'll have the kick have a low end, but I'll settle with and have the sub substitute it, but I won't get rid of the low end of the kick. I'll just diminish it a bit. So here, especially if it's not a kick that doesn't have a tone I'm super into. But then if I make this sort of a move, when I have moments where the kick is not, I'm going to have to undo those moves. I'll have to either automate them off or mute my EQ effect, or not mute, but bypass it so that my sound comes through clearly. So if I'm playing right now, so here let's see if we could beef up our kick a bit. Let's grab a Maximus, and there's a phase off shift, but let's see how it goes. And I usually don't like having super strong attacks at the fronts of my kicks like that. If I'm going to augment it, I generally want to do it in the mid-range. Sounds like the click is up here. And I didn't like what I heard right here. That just sounded like crap, so I don't want that. And then we could experiment by messing with our low end here. And so there's another trick that sort of comes in handy. If you spot like a spot where your kick specifically hits, not all kicks do this. You can put a little boost right there. And by boosting it right there, your ear will say, okay, that's where the kick is. And even though your sub bass may occasionally go down there, the kick will, because the kick's been there the whole time, your ear will sort of be like, okay, well, I hear mostly the kick because that's what I've been hearing. So we could play this sort of psychoacoustic trick. That way we don't have to worry about automating EQs on and off like I was suggesting earlier. However, I've used both techniques and they both work really well. And so I'd be careful about getting too specific with this. Like it is just mostly a general shape. Like, okay, we have a little bit of a roll off. We don't like what's here. And we want our snap back a little bit. Now, there's not that much going on here. So I could pretty safely boost right here. But I also want to be careful about any noise that's in the sample if I decide to run this through like some heavy compression later. And then, of course, we have to go through our snare. And this isn't a lesson on mixing, but it is on like, okay, I think I've reached a pretty nice compromise between our sub and our kick. And I could even consider ducking. However, in this sort of a track, wouldn't really roll too well. I'd have to be pretty transparent with any volume ducking that I tried to do. Maybe like very light ducking, but... as opposed to what we had before without Maximus or the EQ. Our sub just rolls right over anything that was of the kick. And we haven't even done a proper mix yet. These are all just like moves I would do in the middle as I'm moving towards making a cool track. So you can see the kick just pops right back up. Now it is a little bit louder, but not too much louder for the amount of tone we got back out of it just by balancing some of the spectrum out. So anyways, there's that pretty lengthy, like comprehensive explanation. Now we could try adding sub bass another way, a more natural way. And so instead of adding in a separate bass, you may want to consider just coming in here and saying, well, this is what's playing my chords. It may make more sense for me to just add a bass part to my piano. You know, like what if I just took what was in my bass over here, and instead I want to be careful about cutting stuff. Let's just go to a new instance and add a bass part for the piano and put it right there. And hear what that sounds like as opposed to the sub. Because sometimes, you know, it's just going to be a more natural sound. Piano has more harmonics and it will meld with a timbre that already exists. So it tends to make more sense. Sometimes adding like a whole separate deal is not the best idea. Now here, I think it's a terrible idea, just so you know. I don't think it's a great idea at all. But it's something to consider because sometimes it's a way better idea. It just depends. Maybe. Nah. You may consider just adding things. At this point, we're really just, I'd get into theory and talking about like inversions and making smooth inversions and voice leadings and a bunch of other crap. So we are not going to do that right now. Anyways, there's a whole bunch of things to consider. Let's move on to the next portion. So this one's more about, besides adding a bass sound, I should probably save this as like the one we worked on as opposed to saving over it. Save as bass. We'll put worked on. And you'll know what this is if you watched this. So that's what it'll be. So this is our next one. So we have a lot of options to go on here. Let's see. I'll really quick want to make sure that I cover at least what I wrote. So there's the second loop. It's got these crazy sounds. And a lot of them are based on distortion and musical automation. I remember writing quite a bit about that. So here, we really want to make room for our kick, similar to how we did in our first track, besides just adding a bass. And here I've got this analog distortion effect inside that includes a peaking filter and some other nifty tools. And what's really interesting about analog distortion and any nonlinear distortion, which is just the distortion that doesn't boost frequencies in a linear manner. So here's like a nonlinear distortion. We'll talk about this later. There's quite a bit of math that no one ever talks about, but I've learned it now. So now I kind of want to share it, but I also feel like I shouldn't because it's just, I doubt most people have the math chops to handle it anyways. So, I mean, there are totally people out there who know way more math than me, but I'm talking about people who watch my videos and make beats, you know? So, or just songs, music in general. But anyways, the moral of the story, the thing, if you're going to remember anything about nonlinear distortion, is phase matters. When you put in a frequency and one frequency is slightly louder, a nonlinear distortion can take that small difference in amplitude and just blow it up to like completely different proportions. And it has to do with the math of how these things work. But we're not going to jump into that. But just so you know, we are going to mess with that here. So by changing small differences in amplitude, we can accomplish large tonal differences. And it also depends on how severe our shape is. So this shape right here, well, it won't have as very much effect on our sound. Like it'll bring things up. It's almost like a tone. It's almost like a tonal deal here, more than a distortion. But it's accomplished via distortion. So if I play this, let's go into what's creating our bass sound. And so here's our first bass sound. And let's see if we can. Actually, that first part of that. Bow, bow. I can't even make that noise. And the way it's happening is I'm automating this effect here. You can see it just moving up and down. So that's what's creating the sound like that you hear. And that is being created by a filter moving up. But anyways, all we want to do is say, well, let's try adding a sub. Okay, so for our first sound here, we've got our bass now, all that stuff about distortion. This distortion does not behave like this one will, and our curves are pretty gentle. So adding a sub bass here will be more just like a tone was added underneath, especially at an octave. Check it out. So if we just boost the fundamental, you won't hear very much of a change at all. So that's what's going on there. So not that big of a change. Now, if we added like a saw wave, you would hear a new layer and it could offer some new tonal adjustments. We really boost it up there. Now let's try adding it an octave below. Now you'll definitely hear a difference here. It'll add this low, like it could be useful in some styles of music, but generally it's not something you want. And so here you might be going, why such a radical difference? And look at that, sounded totally different than the first one. Versus. They all sound different. You might be going, what's up with that? Well, all that stuff I just said about distortion here applies, and it applies more here. And you might be going, why? Well, we're messing with the harmonic series. We've added a new fundamental. And so by adding that fundamental, the way the distortion sees it completely changes. So distortion is a topic for another day, but if we just do it with a sine wave, check it out. Here's our original, an octave below. Now we could automate these things to get really fancy. I kind of want to avoid that for now, but maybe you want something that's really just this big, ugly thing. Then this could be a way to accomplish such a timbre. Now, if we do it at the octave, we have not altered the harmonic series like we did before, and so the results are a lot less noticeable. However, this can also be very noticeable if you have a huge amount of processing following it, because you're going to change a little change to input. A distortion could, if it's a really crazy distortion, it could really mess it up, followed by whatever else you have after that. So pretty interesting thing. If we do things like triangle waves, these are more like layers, but as soon as we change the harmonic spectrum, we get just totally different brand of noise. And that's largely why. So anyways, I just wanted to point that out here with these. When you add sub-bass to these, they're more of tonal changes than they are of supporting roles. Well, typically what we'll have to do, check this one out. If we come over here to the second portion, this is our original. Let's go ahead and add in a triangle wave. It's a totally different brand. Versus at the octave. It sounds more like a layer than anything. And these could be sort of used to fill in maybe holes in your spectrum that you'd want to fill up. Maybe there's not a lot happening at that moment in time. So there's some options for you that you could find super useful. I'll show you various examples where it really tiny moves. Like I've got a track where I set up the processing in such a way that if just by having this on like 3 or 2, it made a tremendous difference in the sound. And it's pretty amazing like how big a difference it can make. Or it was the detune knob, it wasn't the sub. The sub was moving, but as soon as I moved the detune by like 2, the sound just Listen, like, there you go. Here it is before. Versus. It's a huge difference. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But stuff that I just want to show you that largely has to do with the sub bass, but in a way we've not really talked about formally or prepared for yet. So anyways, there's some things you could try with the sub. And if we come in here and look at this, I'm automating the EQ and stuff. You can dig through the project file on your own if you want. But now we know, okay, well, adding a sub bass, if we want a bass sound, and I've been talking about sub basses like these, these low end things that are supposed to add a supporting role. So if we want to get one of those in here, we're going to have to add in a separate one just like this one. So for example, we could come into this bass line and just give a look at the notes we're working with here. A G. All right, fine. We'll put a G down here. So let's go down here and add a, oh, there are tacos downstairs. Add a G. And you can hardly hear it because there's already so much going on here. So we would have to come in here, cut out some of the low end, which is probably something we don't want to do. So this is like a sound by sound thing. So, and like Zomboe, for example, is a really great example. You can listen to some Skrillex tracks, another great example of they sometimes leave whatever was the original sound there. And sometimes they'll go in and they'll really chop it off and just add in a separate sub because it will come across cleaner on larger systems. And just in general, sometimes low end stuff will invite just crap down on the low end you just don't want down there. If we were to look at this, we could come in here. We could say, okay, well, let's add an EQ, which I have lost my bearings a little bit on where it's at. There it is, and say maybe this stuff right here. You know what the heck? Let's cut out some of that. Let's cut out around up to 86 hertz. You can notice the perception changes quite a bit, but because this is after all our processing, it just sounds a little thinner. And maybe in order to preserve that low end, this sound I think is one that we would not add a sub to, but just to show you what I mean, we could come in here and then add a G. Also be careful, sometimes the tuning, a distortion can screw with tuning because of all that stuff we talked about, our perception of tuning. So be careful sometimes with distortion. So now we get this solid tone that's like really like boom, and we could have this be like, you know, much louder. And it's a lot easier also to work with the mixing because now you got to keep in mind our kick drum's fighting for space down there too. So if we have a bass and we decide to leave the bass there, our kick's going to be sort of starving for air. If it has to fight one frequency, all you got to do is make sure your kick has a resonance that's at a different frequency. In the case where our sub hardly moves ever, which in these sort of tracks typically happens. You know, we're not playing huge ranges with the sub. Over here, our sub moves a lot more. So our kick, you know, has to sort of find its own way. We define our kick by having it repeat the same frequency, and that gives the kick the sound. Over here, we could do even better by just having it play a different spot. So the separate sub could be really useful mixing wise. But anyways, I just want to share with you a bunch of those things. These are all options you have. You can come in here and mess with it. If you're going to add sub to other sounds, so go ahead, give this a shot. We've talked about flux, and now we've talked about if your EQ, if you make a cut, if your notes are moving, you should move. Like, for example, our notes are going to move. What happens if our note on our frequency cutoff moves past where our filter is? Well, we're going to have to move our filter so that it doesn't, you know, chop our bass down. So we're going to have to move things around dynamically. So that's when I say, should we add a cut? And if we do, does our cut need to move around? Should we add flux to our cut? Do we want to even add little resonance boosts up and down throughout our track? Another thing to consider that I saw that I had not mentioned, I also talk about, like, are things important? Now the tones, we talk about the tones, which is largely what I just showed you. You could try a bunch of different things there. I think we're pretty solid. I've given you a ton to think about. If you have any questions about this stuff, let me know. I think it's pretty interesting stuff. Obviously. Subscribe, support me on Patreon, and have a blessed day.